What I'd like to do in this video is talk a little bit more about approaches and landing and their different conditions. We already covered one with normal landings. I'm going to kind of summarize and review that and then bring up a major bullet point here on this next portion of landing condition, approach and landing condition that I would like to discuss, and that is crosswind landings. So with that, what I want to do is again just cover a couple points here that we talked about earlier. Most of the time, fortunately, with our flying, we have relatively benign or normal conditions that don't really challenge us like some of the other things that are involved in an approach and landing under various wind conditions and runway conditions. And we're going to cover all of those as we go forward. But as I mentioned in that previous video that is out there on YouTube now, an objective for all of us is try and make as smooth a landing as possible. And I mentioned that the 737 is not necessarily the easiest airplane to land consistently. Eventually that may happen, just trial and error over time, and I think it's important to be able to talk about this with some veteran pilots and get some techniques. I mentioned too that those two techniques, as you approach that last 150 to 100 feet, take and refocus your eyesight down the runway, well down the runway if you're making a landing that includes a flare. Now, with that, for some reason, it just seems to work out better. That refocus point makes a better flare situation for you to land with a better result. The other one that I talked about was this 10-foot called the bump. Well, actually, I want to also recall, too, that, it really starts at 30 feet. When you hear that 30-foot call in a radio altimeter, then kind of start thinking about relaxing that pressure. And we hear 10 foot, just kind of slightly bump it forward. If you saw that video, what I said is think it. Don't actually make an aggressive move to go forward or even a moderate move to go forward. Just make it almost a thought that you're relaxing and maybe moving that yoke forward. Now, I'm going to say the next thing we're going to talk about here is crosswind landings. And with that, I think the bump technique here that we talk about is probably the one that'll give you the best result for crosswind landings. I mentioned this before too, putting it here in this bullet point. Work hard to always land in the touchdown area. That's considered to be 1,000 to 1,500 foot down a runway. One of the things that happens when you're trying to make smooth landings with this airplane is to always try, flare, and you wind up flaring, going beyond the 1,000-foot point, going beyond the 1,500-foot point, and landing well down the runway. Don't get in a habit of being sloppy about being precise on aiming at your specific landing point. Now, in some cases here, when you're making approaches and landings to shorter runways, and sometimes under some runway conditions, that you want to use more footage on the runway rather than it behind you. So in those cases, really be working toward 1,000 foot. That should be comfortable, and that's an easy objective for a professional airline pilot. But when you do intend to do something like landing specifically in the short part of the touchdown zone area or prior to a touchdown zone area in some unusual conditions, if you intend to do that, make sure that you communicate to your flying partner what your intent is. I've seen just many situations where somebody does something on their own that's a little bit out of what the norm and the standard is, and they never say anything about it. And you leave your partner in no man's land about wondering what you're doing. A good open communication cockpit, which should be encouraged by the captain, is always communicate with one another what your intentions are if you're doing something that might be out of what is the norm. Now, We're going to, in the next section here, we're going to talk about crosswind landings. We'll get to gusty landings, wind shear, and contaminated runway in the future. But the thing that I want to touch on with crosswind landings, I think the best choice of the two methods that are available to you with the wing low or the crab, the best choice, in my opinion, is the crab technique, because so many of the airplanes that are flying now, 737s, have the scimitar configurations. And that gets pretty limited on what that wing low can be before you do some damage on that wing. So I would really encourage you to think about the fact that crab technique is a better technique to preclude that. And one of the things I mentioned earlier too is that the 737 is designed to be able to land in a crosswind condition, even with a slight crab. And so if you have that slight crab, just a slight crab, I'm not talking about a big crab, but if you have a slight crab that falls within the parameters of the auto land system, you're fine on landing with the crab technique. Folks, as we are about to start this video, what I want to do is just explain a couple things. Number one, with this simulator situation that I have, I cannot manually disengage it to fly it. So with this, we're going to take this in the autopilot mode down to about 30 feet, because that's where, with the crosswind, if you're using the crab method, where you really want to start to apply the rudder and aileron and land in either straight ahead or a slight crab to land the airplane. And in this case here, obviously, you know, these crosswind landings are maybe not going to be quite as smooth as you would have in other situations. But the thing that I really want to emphasize here, I mentioned it earlier, is that here is where that little bump maneuver at 10 feet is probably one of the best ways to complete the landing rather than trying to flare it in a crosswind. But anyway, you know, talk about it with others, especially those of you that are new to flying this airplane. Really get as much information as you can in choosing a technique. Now, another thing that I'm going to bring up at this point, you know, recently here in the news, many of you may have seen it. I'll tell you what, some major airframes are being bent with some of the landings. And you know, the reality is there's a lot of us that are now flying here that don't have some of the experience that has been pilots have had in the past. And I'll tell you what, crosswind landings, it's one of the more difficult maneuvers for an airline pilot, is landing in some of these strong crosswinds that very generally have gusts associated with it. Now, there's going to be a lot of different ways that people say to fly this. Now, one of the things that I would highly recommend, let me digress for a second here. This is an area that you don't get much training in when you go through new hire training or when you're in the simulator world. Personally, I think that's something that, you know, that companies ought to really take a serious look at, that this is one of the more difficult conditions to operate in. You get very little experience with it, and consequently, when people come out here and make crosswind landings, they haven't had much education on techniques. They haven't had much practice. I mentioned in some of the other modules there, this is an area where get out there on a 3-mile final and over and over and over again, make some approaches and landings, try some different techniques if you want to, and learn to be able to operate the airplane, the landing. I tell you, in training, most airlines probably have some minimum requirement for it, but I can tell you that, boy, it's really some amazing and surprising things you see with individuals trying to make crosswind landings. And this is an area where some people are really good at it. They're natural, but most of us aren't. So anyway, what we're going to do here is talk a little bit about the crab technique to a landing. And I want to emphasize again something I said in a previous part of this module, is that this airplane can handle landing in a crab. That is, the airplane is designed for that, for auto land. So don't necessarily think that you have to be directly pointed in the center line of the runway. The nose can be either a little left or right depending on what the crosswind situation is. The other thing that I would highly recommend is if you're landing in these kinds of conditions, you have an ILS available to you, use the ILS. And don't be flying so much visual as you're flying an instrument approach until you get down around 300 feet or so. Now, I'm not saying not to be in and out. You want to be in and out, but really fly the localizer and the glide slope. Another thing that I would recommend, this is for me personally, in my experience, I would use the autopilot down to the area of 200 to 300 feet. I know there'd be others that would speak differently to that. But when you're flying it manually, you're going to be up and down and all around on localizer and glide slope. The autopilot's going to do a great job of keeping it there so that you're in the slot at 300 feet. It's one of the worst things that starts to happen when you're flying manually is if you're out of that cone at 300 feet, it's going to get wild. So I'm an advocate of the autopilot in this situation down to 300 feet. Now, if you don't have an ILS, well then, then that's maybe something that you have to consider differently in terms of using the autopilot. But I want to mention to you right now, the winds that are reported on the ground is 090 at 20 gusting to 30. Now notice here on our nav display, our wind vector right now is roughly 050 at 20 knots. So that's going to change as we go down. And I can see on my progress page, page 2, which we've talked about here before, we can see that right now what's acting on the airplane is a 12 knot right crosswind and a head knot component of 15. So we're going to release ourselves here and let's go see what we can do. Landing gear is coming down. We're going to go to flaps 15 and set the bug appropriately. We're coming up on the final approach fix. We're on glide slope, on localizer. I'm going to engage the second autopilot. Notice how the wind is turning around a little bit more to the right with that crosswind. We're over the final approach fix at the appropriate altitude of 1,600 feet. Continuing. We got a command, meaning both autopilots are operating. We've got a white-green flare. Some of these things are the important things to note when you're making a auto land with Cat 2 and Cat 3 conditions. I'm going to go ahead and scale, and we're going to go to final flaps. Now here we're going to add a few knots with this because we've got a gust factor of 10 knots. So we'll talk a little bit about that kind of condition here. Now here's the thing that I want you to notice on your nav display. Notice that we do have a pretty good crab, really about 10 degrees right crab here. Now from out here it doesn't look like we have it, but as we get closer you're going to see that we do. Now that is now a direct crosswind, and we see here we've got a 19 knot crosswind from the right and just a little bit of a headwind. It's essentially almost calm in the headwind vector. But as we get closer here, we're getting down around 500 feet. I'm maybe going to pause this here too to help us see a few things. But we've got a pretty good crab in here. And we'll notice that even more as we get closer. So now we're at 300 feet. Now here's a point where in the real world I would consider disconnecting the autopilot, keeping myself in and out, flying that localizer and that glide slope. Localizer and that glide slope. When I get down, I'm going to pause it here. here I am down here at 100 feet. Now, I want you to notice here, we're a little bit high on the glide slope. I am going to let this auto land. Now, with this situation, gang, this is beyond the limits of what probably is authorized to make an auto land with this kind of crosswind of 20 knots, okay? But I want to take it down there so that you can see how this crab is in here. It doesn't look like we've got much of a crab, but it is in there. We've got this good crab that is correcting for the crosswind here, and the airplane can land in that bit of a crab. So I'm just going to illustrate that to you, even though this is a little bit out of limits for what you'd probably be certified to do. So I'd be applying some left rudder, and now notice, what the simulator program is probably doing here is having applied some of that rudder, because you're going to land in a little bit more of a crab than what you see here. Although this does illustrate a crab. Look where the nose of the airplane is, so pointed over here, but we're landing on the center line. And what you're going to have to do in this situation here is apply that left rudder to straighten out and track the center line, and be quick with seeing that the speed brake is extended, and starting to get your auto brake, and just use the rudder to align it to the runway. But this is giving you a pretty good depiction of landing in a crosswind using the crab method. Gang, this is hopefully a little bit of an illustration of using the crab method versus the wing low, and the airplane is capable of doing that. For some of you, ever taxied behind a 737 and you see, my gosh, this thing looks like it's cattywampus from some hard landings it's taken. Well, really what it is the casters in the main gear. When you've got some kind of crosswind that's, while you're taxiing out, the airplane has a tendency to turn toward the wind. So in any case, this is a little bit of an example of being able to land this airplane in a crosswind. I would definitely suggest that this is where the bump method that I talked about is probably one of the best ways to make a landing that is fairly smooth. If you flare in a crosswind, we can get some pretty wild things that can happen on touchdown. Thanks very much for your time and attention. Hopefully this is helpful.